Okay, so I want to overview the terms first as properly defined to make sure it's clear before I kind of move on, because I kind of wasn't really clear, and I'll post this up with the definitions that I think are proper for framing the context of the conversation. So racism, as defined, as I'm going to define it, is the ideology of a particular conception of race. Okay, a particular conception of race, the ideology of it. In the specific context that I'm talking about, in the modern context, with regard to white supremacy, this involves the colorist division of people based on skin color, mainly white and black, usually together with and based on the continental understanding, based on division of European, African, and Asian. Okay? So it's an ideology based on a particular conception of race. That's racism or racist. And it's based on the color, basically first, white, black, and Asian, based on the concept of European, African, and Asian. And white supremacy is the establishment of, or the ideology of the establishment of and dominance and superiority, including associations which work together as a totality. And these associations or these aspects of society are cultural, social, political, economic, scientific, religious, and based on philosophy, etc., like I mentioned before. Okay. So basically, to explain that again, when I say racism based on a conception of race, and I already discussed that, but the reason why, just to get kind of deeper into it, is obviously Europeans were the ones that were, if you look at the maps you look up a map basically where they have the maps where it says places that were British colonies were invaded or that Britain went to war with, and like you can see like the entire globe is red, besides parts of the desert and like Antarctica and stuff. Pretty much everywhere in the world they went and tried to put their footprint. If you look at basically what happened in the United States, what happened in the United States colonies, but obviously, America, the American colonies, which was the Spanish, British, Dutch, even Russian. Basically a whole bunch of groups from Europe that flooded in and to seize land and set up their own, and from the United States, set up their own governments, set up basically expansive world power within the United States. Okay, that came from Europe. So you could see how it'd be ideologically beneficial for one to link these groups all together. And then especially within the context of the slave trade. Because if you want to subjugate a certain group of people, you need an ideological justification for doing so. You need explanation to the people of that country for doing so. You need a unified group of people in order to combat any type of uprisings and events that might happen. Obviously, you don't want poor whites, or what they call whites. You don't want poor groups of Americans teaming up with, blacks, for example. You don't want these groups teaming up. So if you get them to accept the conception of whiteness and kind of shift over to your side, you can see the effectiveness of that. And also within the context of, like I said, colonialism and imperialism later on. If you want to invade the Middle East and you have this conception that, these Asian groups are different. So if you look at imperialism, you look at the wars that happened in Vietnam, you looked at certain control of particular times in history of China. If you look at, like I said, at Vietnam, Korea, if you look at the wars in the Middle East, and then you look at like the genocide of natives and Indians in the Americas, obviously you could see how the conceptions of these three group categories that I mentioned earlier of European, African, and Asian make like perfect sense within that context. That's how that had to be. And like I said, with white supremacy, you have to understand that it's not just, first you have to understand that it presupposes that conception of race, white, because it's white supremacy. It's not British supremacy. It's not Jewish supremacy. It's white supremacy. It's not even freaking Western. It's not, U.S. supremacy. It's white supremacy. Okay. And what you have to understand is that it's the ideology that you're dominant and superior. And what you have to understand about the ideology is that you don't have to personally believe that. That it's not a requirement that you personally believe that. The only thing that's a requirement is that's the functioning of society and the dominance. I mean, you could have a roundabout way to believe it. I mean, if you believe capitalism is the best system that, that there is for humans, if you believe democracy, liberal democracy and liberalism, and those particular ideas that came from people like John Locke and, Thomas Jefferson and people like that, if you believe those ideas are fundamentally the best ideas that humankind came up with, you're buying into white supremacist ideology. Just flat out. If you believe the structuring of society that as the Europeans laid it out in these areas. I mean, if you support foreign wars and wars of dominance, imperialism, that's what you're supporting. I mean, if you're supporting political parties that support mass incarceration and Jim Crow and segregation, or segregation even in a modern sense, not like forced, but economic segregation. Segregation basically on grouping up poor black people into, small areas and flooding in the police, flooding in drugs, not ever dealing with the issues. You're supporting white supremacist ideology. Okay? And the same would apply to racism. If you're supporting this conception of the groups between blacks, the difference, the groups, black as a group, white as a group, that's what you're supporting. And that's another thing that I want to get into. I'll get into a little bit later. I'm just going to go ahead and move on. For this section, I'm going to go 2 examples again. The first is one that I already talked about, is colonialism and slavery, specifically the United States. Through this, one can see the ideological function of racism from the start, with the stripping of particular West African peoples who were shipped as slaves to the Americas. And they were stripped basically of their own cultural, their own native cultural, religious, so on and so on, identities, basically. And through political practices of labeling them, categorizing them as black, you could see how the connection between the concept of race, along with actions carried out by certain entities, on the identification of the enslaved individuals and their descendants through the redevelopment of culture within a social, political, and economic context as black. And I'll try to explain that kind of in a layman's term, basically. But what I mean by that is you start out as an association with a particular tribe in Africa. When you're kidnapped, put on a ship, everything's stripped from you, religion, your language. You're not allowed to associate with your groups of people. You're spread across. And in America, this was the worst. Okay. You're spread across, for example, your family split up. You're spread across the United States. You're stripped of your language. You're provided with a religion, Christianity. You're Christianized. You grow up without any type of connection. You're taught English. That's the language that you have to learn. And you're called black. Eventually, you develop, because human beings are going to develop culture. You develop culture. You adapt. You become a part of the American society. Even though you're never really a part of it. But the identity of black gets created through that. And that's an objectification of blackness and whiteness in society. You have to understand that. That's a big deal. Okay? So there's basically, from that, a de facto racism. Black exists as a culture within the United States. Okay? It's an economic class. It's poorer. You could look at certain features. This mass incarceration, all the discrimination that took place, the after effects of slavery, the things that were developed, from comedy to music, American music, rap, the blues, jazz, the way people dress, hip hop culture in general. There's cultural. If you look at the way people talk from particular areas, the way black people talk, a lot of people, you hear a person talk and you might say the person talks, oh, you talk black. or you talk, you sound like a black person, right? There was cultural redevelopment of culture and association under the category of black had become objectified. So regardless, even if you're the type of person who now understands, because we do understand with genetics and DNA, that black is no longer black, white, that division is, it never has been, it never was an actually scientifically or biologically viable category. If you look at groups of Africans, there's tons of differences between specific groups. You go to one part of Africa and look at one tribe. I mean, you could tell the DNA based on, tribal DNA. I mean, there's huge differences. There's no way genetically to link people based on the color of the skin. That was just a completely ridiculous notion from the beginning. It was just ridiculous. But socially, these differences developed because of that ideology. And now we're at the point where, if you look at blacks in America specifically, it's a reality. It's a reality that, and the same thing with whiteness. And the unique, I want to move on now. This unique phenomena is just unique in several regards. When considering other Caribbean, West Indian countries or African countries, either original cultural connections could be retained or newly developed connections through the establishment of black nations could be developed. Basically, what I mean by that is that, there's certain countries, Jamaica, Haiti, for example, that had revolutions of independence, have their own governments now, are majority black. They have black nations. Even, if you want to look at like the breaking up of borders, the creation of borders in Africa, like Nigeria or something, but there's still tribes in Nigeria. There's still tribal identification. There's a national identification, whereas blacks in America have to identify as black Americans. There's no other, they didn't come together and, liberate themselves. They're still part of the original culture. In the case also of several Latin American nations, the similar revolutions, independence movements, a lot of socialist movements in, Latin America took place. Cuba, and Venezuela, obviously you have them being called socialists. A lot of those countries had revolutions. A lot of those countries kind of separated themselves from Spain. There was a lot of intermixing as well. But like I said, I'm going to move on again. The unique situation, like I said, of American blacks, descendant from slaves, is that is one in which their liberation movement, the Black liberation movement in the United States, takes place within a colonial nation with a majority dominant colonial group expressing and representing global dominant hegemonic imperialist power, basically, which is the United States. And this power, which also inserted itself from a imperialist standpoint into the affairs of other countries as well. Once there was liberation movements in these other countries, in these other African countries, and these other Central South American countries, it was the United States that were intervening in these movements to either throw out leaders or whatever else. The second example that I want to give is of the terrorist violence, basically. The old, what would you consider when people say, it's not racist like it was in the 60s or 50s or before, Jim Crow, segregation, basically, versus contemporary practices is what I want to talk about. There's the terrorist violence, the Jim Crow, the segregation versus contemporary practices. The first concern to notice is the transferring of inflamed animosity into political action and otherwise violent events during the former era. This can be contrasted with a more developed mode of economic and political control to illustrate the support rendered by the dictionary definitions and masking the underlying ideological problems. In addition, there's support rendered through ignoring the dynamic aspects of objective and subjective conceptions and highlighting only moments. That is a combination of taking either subjective feelings, sentiments, and claims of personal beliefs, or taking the system and institutions in a specific regard to ignore the base ideological conceptions that play under the tolerance or an absence of animosity, driving the perpetuation of fundamentally racist and white supremacist system and its institutions. Which I don't know if that sounded a little bit more complicated than what it is or not. But basically what I mean by that is that there is that, for one, there's the assumption that the racist animosity and intolerance has to be there for it to function, which allows you to ignore the elements of the system and the way the system could be utilized against certain people, and also ignores the history and the white supremacy and racism as I've been explaining throughout. Okay. But also, from the other standpoint, you could look at the institutions themselves and ignore the actual perpetuation of the ideology itself, that I described before. So that's pretty important. And one of the things that you could notice is, as well as like I mentioned with the Jim Crow segregation versus the contemporary practices, which the reason why that during the Jim Crow South that they had to do a lot of what they did was because of the building of this racist ideology. Because, for example, after slavery, blacks were in a great position to get their own land, to join in politics, to develop their own economic success, to develop their own cultural, identity, to develop their communities, their values, to educate themselves. And that was what Jim Crow and segregation and basically the instituting of slavery through the prison system was about at that time. The criminalization of black life, basically. It was about creating a situation in which that couldn't happen, that couldn't take place, and to keep them as a low class, to not be competing. Okay, it was needed at that point. But what happened, obviously, was after the culmination of all of it was that it got actualized in society. You don't need to do anything to keep someone poor where they don't have any opportunities upon which to build. You could do less. All right, let's just put it like that. You could do less. You don't really have to go into black communities to make sure that they're not running for politics, to make sure that, they're not getting educations, to make sure that, they're not developing any leaders when you've done created a situation from having done all that in the past where, they're boxed into poor communities, where they're boxed into communities with low educational opportunities, where they're, where you flooded the scene with immigrants, where you put them in a socio and political and economic situation, which basically realized your expression and your sentiments and your ideological framework and your system that had the conception of them as inferior, and you wanted to establish yourself as dominant. Once you carry that out, once it took place, eventually it becomes a reality. Basically, I guess the easiest way to consider it would be a self-fulfilling prophecy, basically. The last thing I wanted to do was clean up the examples. But with clearing up the examples, what I was going to do was go over all the things like this level that Trump as far as the housing discrimination or tweets. However, the main levying of the labels of him as racist, or things that this labeled as racist towards Trump, came from his political campaign. Obviously there was the housing discrimination, but that was way far back. I don't really want to get into any of that. Trump's campaign and media coverage within the overall political landscape was one of using the 2016 cycle basically as the basis. It was one of triangulating between Clinton and Sanders. Okay. What the campaign was trying to do was take negative attention away from Hillary and positive attention away from Bernie. And if you look at his policies and what he supported and what he was saying, you'll see that's basically exactly what the goals were. With Bernie, this was done with being relatable as the anti-establishment candidate, opposing foreign wars, talking about infrastructure, the trade deals. With Hillary, which is relevant here, this was done by taking negatives away from her own issues from minorities. I mean, the attacks against, immigrants, for example, and women. I mean, if that wasn't obvious. If you don't know that Hillary Clinton had problems in those areas with women and with other communities, then that's a larger political discussion and one of how political attacks are done, and but I'm not going to get into that in detail. But I'm just telling you what Trump did. Okay, and this was all done by maintaining an anti-political correctness demeanor, loose talking, and baiting on race and immigration-related issues. Okay, this was done by intentionally making comments and leaving room for the media to then run with the ideas, as well as using the tactics of doubling down, ignoring, and refusing to denounce certain situations. I mean, this was all done purposefully. Trump's not doing this stuff by accident, and he's not doing it specifically to rile up racial animosity. He's not doing it specifically to inflame racism or white supremacy or any of that. This was done specifically first within the context of the 2016 campaign, but within an overall political context. That's why it was done. For one, it was done really to help Hillary for a while. It actually did do a lot to help Hillary. Until eventually, during the campaign, he had so much of a lead, and it was kind of working almost against him. I think just basically, it came to a point where there was nothing he could do, and then he won, and then these type of things were continued to attack Trump and kind of working within the overall political context of a division between the parties and allowing both parties to maintain their relevance and work basically off of each other and keep the vast majority of the population down and out of the fight, basically. So, that's it for this video. I hope it comes together nicely. I hope I got my point across. If there's any questions, please comment, like the video, subscribe to the channel.